All right, welcome and good afternoon to you, Dr. Belzer, and all of our friends and supporters on Facebook Live. We're thankful to have you with us today. Real quick, we've got 45 minutes to explore this topic of debunking the driver shortage myth, and we are really privileged to be joined by Dr. Michael Belzer. I'll let him introduce himself in more detail. But just briefly, Dr. Belzer is a former Teamster tank trunk driver with 10 years and more than 750,000 miles of over-the-road experience. He is currently a professor of economics at Wayne State University, where he teaches principles of macroeconomics and is a noted expert in this field, providing his expertise to a number of administrations over at DOT over the years. Dr. Belzer, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
All right, our pleasure. So obviously, I am aware of just how illustrious you are in this field, but for our folks who are joining who may not be aware, tell us a little bit about your background and why what you have to share should be taken seriously and is highly relevant to our understanding of this issue.
So I guess it should be taken seriously on its own merits, but specific to my background, I teach PhD courses at Wayne State University. The PhD sequences in labor economics and in industrial organization. And together they kind of comprise, in a way, the field of political economy. So it's kind of a crossover among all those issues. So I have been working particularly in the area of truck driver safety and health, not because I was originally drawn into truck driver safety and health, but because I was interested in the economics of that. And so that's the origin story, if you will, of the last 25 years of work around truck safety, trucking industry safety, motor carrier safety, truck driver safety. And as I've been branching out more and more, safety and health are related. So I'm finding a lot of the same phenomena true for the truck driver health issue.
All right, well, thank you. I know as I've gotten to know folks in this field that you are frequently referred to as, if you will, the academic godfather in this profession. And your seminal work, Sweatshop on Wheels, that was published in 2000, is widely considered to be one of the most accessible reads that help people really understand the truck driver labor experience and what it means for us all. Could you briefly give us kind of the thesis and main points to help kind of lay the groundwork for us as we explore this truck driver shortage discussion?
So in sum, I suppose, first of all, truck driving has always been a tough job. It was a tough job when they were pack horses. It was a tough job when it was the Pony Express, when it was driving Conestoga wagons. So it's always been a tough job, and that goes back for centuries. The specifics to what we today know as a trucking industry were transformed by deregulation of this industry in 1980. Interstate trucking was deregulated then. Intrastate trucking was deregulated 15 years later. So it's been also a bipartisan thing. People often associate deregulation with Ronald Reagan, and in fact, that's not. It was done by Jimmy Carter. The problem is that the free market approach to economics often doesn't take into account what we call externalities, that is, the costs associated with the production process that the public picks up. So one of those costs is truck driver safety, and especially, as it turns out, health. And also is public safety, which is kind of where you guys come in, where the Truck Safety Coalition has an interest. So whatever is dangerous, unsafe, unhealthy for a truck driver is also dangerous, unsafe, and unhealthy for the motoring public, anybody else who's on the highway. And so I'm kind of most proud of the fact, I guess, that I'm considered the person who from the intellectual perspective anyway, put forward the notion that safety pays and pay drives safety. And so compensation and safety has been my thing now for the last 25 years, and I've been doing research in that area for 25 years. And specifically what the Australians call safe rates. That is, what's the rate, or what are the pay conditions that would make for a safe and healthy trucking industry, and also, by extension, fix a lot of the labor market problems that exist in trucking.
So it's a really insightful point, because I would suspect that the traditional framing of that question would be, what is the lowest price that facilitates the movement of goods that allows for consumers to pay the lowest price? And I think, if I'm hearing you correctly, this externality, this kind of economic keyword, this cost around safety that is on no one's tab, is what is allowing folks to move in that direction, and kind of force that on someone else, regardless of what that may be. Is that an accurate kind of layman's reframing of what you said?
More or less. The idea was developed about 100 years ago by Arthur C. Pigou, an economist, a welfare economist who was very prominent in the 1920s. And the bottom line is that he looks at markets and says they work, except to the extent to which the price between the producer and the consumer of whatever that good or service might be does not reflect the full costs, then the full costs don't just disappear. They got to go somewhere.
Yeah.
And where they go is to the worker, which is the reason why we've established regulations around workplace safety and health, but also goes to the public. And in a workplace like trucking, where the workplace is the public roadway, that becomes a very salient issue. So essentially, the cost of doing business should be embedded in price in order for economic welfare, that is, the costs and the benefits, to equalize, and for everybody to benefit as a society. And to the extent that costs are external to the market, that is, not picked up by anybody engaged in the purchase of those goods and services, then we get inefficiency, and also we get other consequences for different groups in the public, particularly the roadway users.
Because safety right now is uncounted. Is I think kind of the nail there that we are hitting. So let's turn this now specifically to this truck driver shortage drumbeat that we hear quite frequently, I think, in the news media. Now, I will say in the past couple of months, and you may agree as well, we are seeing some more examined reporting and long form editorials by folks who are really digging into this issue with more nuance. Typically, though, what I would see is a quick hit that features quotes from kind of industry experts, where the same line is said every time. And it's basically, we have industry, an 80,000 truck driver shortage. We need to do everything we can to fix this within certain parameters. So what would you say? What is the relationship to what your study has been in those statements? I mean, does that square? Is there some context that we're missing here? What should people know about this claim that there's an 80,000 truck driver shortage?
As you call it, a myth. I think that's true that it's a myth. The question is, where does it come from and how long has it been around? So back to your first question, I started driving a truck commercially in about 1975, and I retired from truck driving in 86 before I went to graduate school and tried to study this question. So I spanned the era before and after that 1980 deregulation period. There was no talk of a truck driver shortage before 1980. It just simply didn't exist because it was a great job, paid well, and there were certain difficulties with the job, but it paid well and the conditions were regulated. In fact, they were regulated by the Teamsters because the Teamsters Union at the time represented about 60 or 70% of all truck drivers. And so they set the minimum wage and maximum hours and the standards of work by collective bargaining. So it was done by collective bargaining at the time. Deregulation transformed the industry dramatically. And by 1985, all of those conditions had been reversed. The Teamsters had been significantly depleted in their ability to organize and to represent people. And that's when you see, I started doing my graduate school work in 87. And very shortly after I began to do that, I saw the citations of a truck driver shortage in the media. And I puzzled over that. And when I did my own dissertation research, which was calling up literally everybody, every motor carrier and what they were called at the time, common carriers of general freight. So there are 250 of them, class 1 level. And they would always say, we have plenty of drivers, just none of them that we want to hire. So I was alerted by the carrier safety and other personnel and employment personnel saying, look, we got a problem out there, but it's not that we don't have truck drivers, it's that we can't get the right kind of people and we can't keep them, so we can't retain them. Fast forward to today, we've been seeing that same number, roughly 80,000, stated in studies going back decades. It's always a shortage of drivers, and yet there are probably 2 or 3 times as many people who actually have commercial driver's licenses as who actually use them. So the bottom line is that there's no shortage. It's that the trucking industry recruits them, can't retain them, and then they go away and they find another group of people to bring in. They chew those up, spit them out, and go away. It is not just the trucking industry, because going back to the free market model you talked about at the beginning, it's really about economic, it's about the lowest price, which has been the shorthand over the last 4 decades for most efficient. But that's not complete, as I noted in that whole notion of externalities. And that's really why the market's not working. When you have 100% turnover standard in the long haul trucking industry, you have an unstable situation.
Yeah, thank you. And I saw, and this was self-reported out of the American Trucking Association in the last year, they averaged your largest, your $30 million carriers and above, reported a 90% churn in the industry for a full calendar year, which is kind of mind-boggling when one considers that length of experience driving is one of the most kind of predictive factors for risk of a crash. And one is most likely that first year, as a matter of fact. So this is very troubling, and I think for those who know the issue, fairly well known, not exactly a mystery. And I think there's a number of factors I want us to dig into here. But if we could start with pay, which you've touched on, kind of truck driver pay, that aspect of it. If pulling that lever in increasing driver pay, what effect does your research indicate that would have on this recruitment, or what I think is probably more accurate that we can agree on, retention crisis?
So it's definitely recruiting and retention. These are both problems. And in fact, whenever I do research, I'm challenged to come up with a way to distinguish those two. And they're very hard to do given the data that we've got. The data are very poor. The data on compensation back when the Interstate Commerce Commission existed, which was sunsetted back in 25 years ago. But when it existed, it collected data on compensation, among other things. And during the early part of the Bush administration, that data set was canceled out. It still shows up on the books, but nobody collects it. It doesn't exist. So we have no way to determine at a carrier level even what the average compensation is. So, but I've done a lot of research now with different data sets and different circumstances, and continue to do that work, that keep showing that at the margin, as we pay more money, we get better people. That is, people who are more stable, who have families to raise and so forth. As we pay lower money, we get people who are less stable, more churn, more of this same continuing turnover problem, and the characteristics that we want, the industry needs, it can't hire because the market drives the compensation of drivers down to such a low level. One important factor is that it took me a long time to kind of figure this out. Sorry, but too long, but it still did. And that is, there's a misfit between Department of Labor regulations around the Fair Labor Standards Act that cover all other production workers, or almost all other production workers, except truck drivers. And they decided 42 years ago, when they did the deregulation and reevaluated the Fair Labor Standards Act, that we don't need to worry about that. But the fact that trucking is not covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act, or not at all effectively covered, we don't need to worry about that because truck drivers are all union members and the Teamsters set the wages. That's the point I made at the beginning. So now that that doesn't happen because unionization has been so reduced down to in the level of 5 to 10% tops, the Teamsters don't have that same influence over wages. And so it's the low pay that drives the turnover problem, that drives the safety problem, that drives the health problem, that leads to a continuation of the same. And it's the excuse for this is that the free market economist will say is, well, it drives lower consumer prices. But pay me now or pay me later, people will pay no matter what. The question is, do we want the market to incorporate that pay or not? And that's really the way to have an efficient system. And we do not have an efficient system.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm glad you brought that up. So let's dig in on that FLSA exemption a little bit more. What does that mean in practicality? And let me preface that with a quote. I know you've probably provided testimony to any number of House and Senate committees, but this is I'm going to read a quote from a hearing just this past November from a gentleman named, let's see here, David Carell, a lecturer at the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics, in a House hearing. And this expert said the following, and I quote, "My research leads me to see the current situation not so much as a headcount shortage of drivers, but rather an endemic undervaluing of our American truck drivers' time." A, I mean, would you agree with that? And B, if so, how does that FLSA exemption kind of connect to that, if it does at all?
So I definitely agree with that. David Carell is, Dr. Carell is involved in a lot of different kinds of research, more on the operations side. So he's looking at the operations. It's MIT after all. But he sees the same thing. So when you have a disconnect between the definition of work that the Department of Labor uses and the Department of Transportation uses, you have the recipe for an ongoing chronic problem, and nobody seems willing to step up and fix this. The definition of work for the Department of Labor, to summarize in a very much of a nutshell, is when people come to work as employees, they are to be paid for all their time, less some narrow exemptions for their meal breaks and couple of other breaks. And if negotiated in advance with a responsible negotiating party, you can have an exemption for sleep time. But in fact, you can't have an exemption even for sleep time, according to the law, according to the regulations, unless it's been negotiated and it's part of this standard. And that's what keeps the rest of the labor market functioning. The Department of Transportation, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration use a different definition. And that definition is when the carrier declares you available for work or declares you responsible, not just available for work, but responsible for the truck and its contents. Only then do you have a right to get paid. Only then do you have a responsibility to log on duty. So what do truck drivers do with electronic logs as well as the old paper logs? Is they log that time that they're not paid for off duty. How much time are we talking about? We're talking about anywhere from 20 to 40 hours a week, depending on the job, of free time.
So help us dig into this, because I think for most people that would be pretty shocking. For example, if I know my internet, from what I can tell, might be going in and out. So if my internet crashes for a couple hours and I can't really do a lot of meaningful work in any occupation I've ever had, I would continue to be paid by my employer. What does this look like for a truck driver? And I think this is very beneficial as a former truck driver from firsthand experience. What does this look like that might surprise some people?
Well, it's kind of a pretty grim picture. Again, I was a truck driver and a teamster, so I was there before and after, and my contract required the company to pay me for my time. So that meant when I went to work, I was paid a mix of hourly and piecework. That is, I was paid by the mile for my driving, according to book miles. So that's a whole nother issue. They aren't true miles, but they're theoretical miles. But I was still paid by the mile, and I was paid by the hour for the time that I was on duty but not driving. That means if I pull into a shipper or a consignee and they hold me up, I'm waiting, I'm paid by the hour until I'm freed. It did not mean, by the way, that if I run into a traffic jam or a snowstorm or rain, whatever it was that might slow me down on a highway or congestion in some urban area, I was still going to get paid by the mile, and the mile I was going to get paid was these book miles. But still, roughly speaking, I was being paid for all my time. Contrast that with the old exempt sector, which today, regulatory exempt, goes back to the 1980 and before era. That segment took over most of the trucking industry. They just flowed in 1980, 81, 82, 83, and basically took over the industry, and they didn't pay for your non-driving labor time. So surveys have shown repeatedly that more than 50% of all truck drivers are not paid anything for their non-driving labor or non-driving on duty time or non-driving time of any kind. And so that means a basic principle in economics is that people will consume an infinite amount of a free good. So if the free good is trucking industry delay time or truck driver delay time, if the consumer of that good, that is the shipper or the consignee in the supply chain, doesn't pay for that time, they'll just consume as much of that as convenient for them. They'll have you arrive at a certain scheduled time and you better make that appointment, but they have no commitment and no responsibility, and they don't pay if they hold you up for any amount of time. So 50%, more than 50% of all drivers get paid for none of that time. And I have seen this repeatedly on logs. And what the truck drivers do is log all that time off duty because they're not getting paid. There's your recipe for safety problems right there.
Yeah, that is insane and certainly absurd, but I can understand how the incentive structure kind of leads to that we have. So we've dug in a little bit to not only is it pay rate, but kind of the structure that allows a driver to get paid in the first place is kind of bananas, I think, to the average person hearing about it. And it seems much of this, maybe not all, is within the control of regulators and motor carriers to address portions of these issues respectively, right? To try to make the job a bit more attractive and reduce that churn. But what we've seen in a very troubling and disturbing trend is an incessant request to have teens under the age of 21, so not just teens, 20-year-olds as well, those who are under the age of 21, be able to drive big rigs, Class A vehicles and below in interstate commerce. Um, in your view, and this is certainly subjective, are these two things connected? And what are your thoughts when you hear those requests by industry to have access to those drivers who, I'll just quickly note, are statistically the worst drivers of passenger vehicles in the country? And the leading cause of death for teens happens to be motor vehicle crashes. Not to influence you in any way, but what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, they've been pushing for this now for, I don't know, around 25 years, pretty close. Because I can remember in the late 1990s being having organized a big transportation research board session on the labor market and having the Truckload Carriers Association president at that time call for two things, which really was jaw-dropping to the crowd in that room at the time. And that was 18-year-olds. We need to get this down to 18-year-olds. And the other one was paroled criminals, or maybe criminals still in the lockdown phase, but maybe able to mix in society. So we want those two kinds of people. And everybody was kind of struck, this is insane. So to your point, if anybody in this audience has either been a teenager or had a teenager, or even an under 25, as we know, person in his or her household, you will be paying an extra higher amount for your auto insurance if that person is a driver. And that's simply because statistically, actuarially, we know that there's a higher probability of these crashes. Now, the question is, what does this proposal do to fix the labor market? And I would say nothing. So first of all, insurance companies are still not going to cover 18, 19, 20-year-olds as truck drivers. The threshold age that has been standard in this industry, that has been by law up to now, has been 21. But 25 is a lot more plausible to an insurance company. So if you got to be insured, the insurance companies can look at your drivers and decide whether or not it wants to risk its money on you. So that's number one. Number two, is it going to solve the labor shortage? No, of course not. Because the problem isn't 18-year-olds. The problem isn't we need to get these folks right out of high school and then we'll be able to hold on to them. The problem is fixing the labor market. It's not just up to the trucking industry to fix the labor market.
Right.
The government can fix the labor market simply by reconciling the regulations that the Department of Labor uses for the rest of the labor market and the trucking industry. If they do that, they can solve this driver shortage problem. They can solve the churn and turnover problem. It can solve the safety problem, and all that because you will simply be, and by the way, you will draw more people into this job, not scare them away. But second of all, I suspect that this administration is concerned about inflation. Well, if we pay these people more money, that's just going to cause inflation. And that's not true if you have an economic inefficiency and the policy closes the gap for that economic efficiency. If in fact shippers have to pay for holding up the drivers, they're going to stop holding up the drivers. It's not that complicated. Right. This is what they're going to do. And it's not going to cause prices to go up, but it will improve economic efficiency and add to gross domestic product, our biggest measure of how we're doing as an economy. So I think it's actually a jobs and growth measure to pay people for their time.
That's a great point. And we will turn to safety here momentarily and then reserve the last 5 minutes of our time for Q&A. We have seen one question come in that we'll pose to you here soon. But if you could, I hear some talk, kind of last point on this teen trucking pilot, which we are very much against for safety reasons. But when it comes to the labor market for truck drivers, with the churn as high as it is, does this, if it were widespread, so right now it's a 3-year pilot, but if it became widespread, would it have an effect of depressing wages and wage growth for more experienced drivers, or no? in your opinion, because the churn is just so high, it wouldn't impact your more experienced veteran drivers?
I don't think that the numbers are great enough that it's really going to drive down compensation. Compensation is already, in spite of what it says in what you hear in the press, compensation is already pretty much rock bottom. What people don't understand, but which they might be able to figure out based on what I've said earlier, is the typical, at least the average truck driver in over-the-road operations is working probably 32 or 3,300 hours per year. So about 50% more hours on average than the typical worker in our society working 40 hours a week, which is 2,000 hours basically. So truck drivers are working about half as much more time on the books. But to the extent that that average or the median, the halfway point between those two figures, uh, to the extent that the number I just gave you, the 3,300 hours or so, is only an average, we're talking about a lot of people who are working probably 4,000 hours a year for this job. So if they're making $60,000 a year, that may be true, although that's, again, not the average. The average is about 48, 49,000 maybe. But that's for people who are working 60 hours a week. So if you actually figure out the hourly compensation, not so great. And how many 18, 19, 20-year-olds do you know really want to be tethered to a truck 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 4 weeks at a time? What kind of life is that? My guess is that that's not going to work out. So they've essentially expended a huge amount of political capital to try to make this happen. And yet they've got this pilot, and that's all well and good, but it's not going to attract enough drivers to change the system.
Sure. I would say that it's not well and good. Certainly an unnecessary risk, an experiment to health on our highways, if you will, life safety. But I hear you, and you make a compelling point. Not just teens, but anyone to put in that amount of hours in those conditions. It's a tough sell, as we can see, for why we're even having this discussion here today. Now, this is a nice segue. This latest infrastructure bill, curiously enough, despite the fact that this teen driver shortage has been studied, or not shortage, teen trucking kind of driving behavior has been studied and found to be wanting quite a bit. The pilot got put through in this latest bill. However, at the very end of that section of the bill text is a request to study the effect of driver pay on retention, and then as well on safety. Now, just as context, the Bureau of Labor Statistics routinely cites truck driving as one of the most dangerous professions in the country, with over 800 truck driver deaths annually, sometimes approaching 900, which is tragic. What is the effect in your research? Of course, we care deeply about safety, both the safety of the drivers and the safety of all roadway users, and can talk at length about it. But in your expertise, what effect does driver pay and retention have on safety at large?
Well, I have a body of research available on my website, and you can stick that up on yours if you want so that people have it. But you can go through that research and you'll find 25 years of evidence that I continue to accumulate. It's difficult given the data weaknesses that I've slightly referred to here. But we have accumulated a lot of research that shows that there is a direct relationship between pay and safety. So the more money you pay, the safer people are. Frankly, the more money you pay, the fewer hours people will choose to work. So if they're, I have a PhD student who worked on this, and his first response was, well, that's terrible. That's a reduction in productivity. And I said, no, that's not a productivity, because productivity is output per labor hour. So if you just increase the number of labor hours, you get more production, but you don't get more productivity. That's a different question. So the fact is, as drivers' pay goes down, they will put out more and more hours because they want to just get enough money to pay the bills, to pay the rent, whatever it is. And that's something that is their motivation. As it goes up above the halfway mark, if you will, and gets up close to 60 hours a week, once the pay gets up to about 60 cents a mile or so, which is quite a bit more than people are being paid now, you see people, according to our data, who are working closer to 60 hours a week instead of 80 or 90. So the bottom line is that as pay goes up, pay rates go up, people will choose to work less time. They won't chase more hours. They will want to have more time off. But more importantly, if the reform were implemented like I suggest, which is paying people for all their work time, seems like a pretty simple concept, but it's amazingly difficult. So if you pay them for all their time, they will choose to work fewer hours. They will log that time on duty because that's what they have to do to get paid. And all the other elements of our economic system will adjust, and they'll start efficiently using the time. And so the drivers will become more safe, more stable, and healthier as a result of working fewer hours. Anybody who's working 80, 90, and 100 hours a week cannot be healthy or safe, especially if their work is driving a truck. You know, I work too many hours, but when I want to get up from my desk, I just get up from my desk. And if I fall asleep at the keyboard, nobody is harmed when I do. That is not the case with truck drivers.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned that. I have to say the vast majority of for those who may not be aware, we have a number of crash victims and survivors who are part of our coalition and volunteer network. And the vast majority have had one of these horrendous crashes, have been impacted by a crash that involved a violation of hours of service or fatigued drivers. So, you know, I just want to hammer home the point a little bit that if we're not honoring the time by paying drivers for time worked, I'm not excusing behavior that encourages someone to drive and push the limits when they may be fatigued. But that is the risk that is being run. That is the dilemma that folks are being put into that I don't think anyone would appreciate being put under. And there's really no reason for it if we're willing to pay a rate that values safety, to go back to one of your very initial points.
If we pay for all time, you will find again that the people in the industry, and it's not the trucking companies, they're losing money too. It's the shippers and the consignees, and those are the people that we buy goods from. So it's your big box stores and what have you. They're getting away with very cheap labor. That contributes to safety, but they don't pay that safety cost. So it doesn't matter to them. It all has to be to have an efficient market. It has to be internalized into the market, and then we'll get the optimum outcome. Let me just say that I was contracted by the group, the government agency that preceded Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. So it was the Office of Motor Carriers in the Federal Highway Administration back in about 1996 to study this question. And 5 years later, I came out with a very long extended report, which again, you can get that report by going to my website. And there are subsequent papers that have been published, but I can give you the report without any problem. That part that was done back then showed the relationship to compensation and safety. So at the end of this bill, it says the Transportation Research Board is supposed to study this again. Now that's great, but there has really basically been nobody but my team working on this question for the last 25 years. So it seems pretty obvious where to go to get the expertise to study this. Some people in the industry might not like that because they might not like the potential of having results they don't like. But frankly, everybody's going to be better off if we fix this problem, whether you're a road user, a truck driver, a trucking company, or frankly, the US economy. Everybody's going to be better. It's not going to lead to inflation. It's going to lead to greater efficiency.
Thank you. And I would just point out we have nearly 5,000 fatalities on our roads from large trucks every year, with an additional 147,000 injured. This is an increase of roughly 47% the last 11 years. So I know we've been having a lot of academic discussion here, a lot of academic words being thrown about, but this is very much grounded in real life outcomes, and lives are on the line with these decisions that are made. Here's a question we have from a Paul Taylor. I wondered if you would be able to discuss, whether it's Department of Labor or DOT, do you think there's a misclassification with respect to lease purchase drivers or so-called lease drivers? And what kind of effect does that have on wages?
Yeah, we have strong growth in subcontracting throughout the American economy, but specific to truck driving, it's very strong growth in subcontracting in the US. A form of that subcontracting looks a lot more like debt peonage than it looks like just subcontracting to private businesses, to other businesses. Debt peonage, for those of you who don't know, who aren't steeped in the law, is a general term for sharecropping. So that is when you do a lease purchase, even if it's technically legally a company that's independent of the trucking company, you are essentially leasing a truck effectively from the company you work for. The company is going to deduct all the expenses of operating the truck and everything else, and you get the residual, what's left over, if there is any. And the company that from which you lease this truck, which is also the company that you're working for that's providing the freight, can control how much work you get and whether it's good paying work or not good paying work. And so the classification and the use of this technique has led to an explosive growth in what is essentially sharecropping. And that is a major threat to the labor market, because you may recall sharecropping was created by Southern plantation owners to substitute for slavery, which we outlawed after the Civil War. So it's not technically slavery, you can leave, but you owe your soul to the company store, and that is actually not an appropriate employment circumstance or even a contracting circumstance. So I view that as something the government can and should fix, and has known about it in decision after decision after decision in federal court, and the government still doesn't do anything about it. So regulators have not done their job. I understand their pressures, but still, this is a broken labor market because of things like that.
That's insane, and is tragically predatory, and very depressing and discouraging to hear about. I did see a portion of the bill that asked for a lease, lend lease task force or something of that nature. I'm not sure what they purport to study with this committee, but there was something in the bill to that effect. We only have a couple minutes left. I would love it if you had a chance, if you had a, if you will, a magic wand, where you could make 1, 2, 3 changes happen tomorrow. What, in your view, would have the most meaningful impact on any aspect of our discussion? Retention, safety, kind of productivity for all. What would be the most impactful to help everyone?
I prefer to stick with one, because I want one thing to get remembered. Pay people for all their time. It's not that hard, seems to me, to change the regulations, to reconcile the regulations that the Department of Transportation uses to define work and the Department of Labor uses to define work. Reconcile those two, make that applicable to all workers in the labor market, in the production side of the labor market, and pay people for all their time. It is certainly possible under the Fair Labor Standards Act to also cover truck drivers and say those workers too have to be paid for all their time. Use an example of yourself, who's a salary worker, I'm sure, on the internet. The internet goes down, but perhaps one that will make more sense to more people Imagine that you're on an assembly line and you're working to make cars, make something or other. And imagine that the assembly line goes down because there's not enough air cleaners of a certain type that have to go onto this car. So they pull the cord and stop the assembly line until they get all the parts lined up to go on. Imagine that you have to stay on the job. You have to stay at your station. You can't actually even go to the restroom. You have to stay at your station and be available for work the moment that line starts up. And we'll notify you a minute before or 30 seconds before it starts up, and you are going to go back on the clock. But until that time, you're off the clock until we're ready for you. That's what truck drivers currently experience with their time. When that assembly line stops for them, which is when they pull into a shipper or consignee and the shipper or consignee says, "Oh, we're not ready for you. Wait out in the yard, sit there in the truck and listen, and we'll call you when we're ready." Their workplace is their assembly line, is their workplace, is their truck, is also their home. So it's really easy to wave your hands and shade off duty and on duty time. So pay people for all their time. We'll get more efficiency, more safety, more health, and close the gap of the mythical truck driver shortage.
That's a perfect way to bring it home. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Belzer. We will send a link to your website that you referenced to everyone who was with us today. And really, we can't thank you enough. I would just briefly, for those who are still with us, encourage you to please donate to the Truck Safety Coalition. All funds received help us have educational opportunities like this, and also continue to help those who've been affected by crashes and pursue and educate the public and policymakers and decision makers on common sense solutions, like was just so eloquently said. That'll make everyone safer. Thank you for your time. We'll be in touch.
You're welcome.